let's kind of start with the shockwave years. Like, how did that happen? Because it's one thing to go from an employee of a company, being in a startup, to being a founder, and in Shockwave's case, from startup to IPO, right? So
Yep.
Yeah. How did that all come about?
So after I had to shut down the Plavina, the biotech company, I was in Maryland, and I got nothing against Maryland. Maryland's great. Because there's no med tech in Maryland, and startup med tech is where I wanted to be, and startup med tech is in California, Minnesota, and Boston predominantly, and that's probably 70-20-10, something along those lines. And biotech has a different ratio, but maybe it's 60-30-10 or some such thing. But it was that nowhere on that list is Maryland, right? So I had to come up with something. At that point, kind of think mortgage to pay, job's not there because the company had to get shut down. My wife's at home with the kids. At that point, we had three. Massive hands full there. And I ended up being involved with an incubator in the Midwest. And as part of that incubator, I helped the company through some stages in their development and growth that ultimately led through changes that we came up with. Ultimately led to that company going public, and it was ultimately acquired by Medtronic. And then we did another one, and that one I was involved very early and helped frame the story for what became a solid Series A. And that company ultimately went public. And it got me closer and closer and closer to formation of companies and what that looked like, and ideation around technology and market focus and the right product to market fit for a technology and disease state growth and all that sort of stuff. And I ended up getting asked by three arch partners that no longer exist, but three arch partners asked me if I wanted to be an entrepreneur in residence. And what that meant was I joined a couple of engineers in Seattle. So I moved from Maryland to Seattle. And Three Arch and what was then Prospect Venture Partners, that also doesn't exist anymore. They each kicked $1 million into a bucket. And that $2 million was given to us, the three of us, with a simple mission: identify an unmet clinical need and invent or in-license technology to meet that need. And if we like it, we, the two venture firms, will provide you the seed capital to the Series A capital to start the company. That was the job. So in some respects, a scary job if you're not creative or not minded towards really early stage and super high risk where you control everything. In another respect, for somebody who is all of those things, it was perfect. And for me, it was perfect. Absolutely perfect. So we ended up, and mind you, I'm not an engineer. I didn't at that time know how to invent. Two guys taught me how to invent, the two engineers I was paired with. Those two engineers were among the very first electrical engineers that worked with a fine gentleman by the name of Earl Bakken. And everybody who's familiar with a tiny little company called Medtronic might be familiar with Earl Bakken. He's the founder, right? So they were involved in the very early engineering teams for the first implantable defibrillator or pacemaker. Their names are John Adams and Cliff Alfrenas. And those guys traded management responsibilities for engineering teams on the first implantable cardiac simulators. Really, really, really smart guys. They had between them founded 6 or 7 medical device companies across clinical specialties. So I learned how to invent from those guys. We identified an unmet clinical need, and I like to say that we co-invented. Really, they more invented and I more followed and came up with some harebrained ideas that were sort of added to a couple of their inventions. And that became a company called Calibra. Calibra Medical was supposed to be in Seattle. I was supposed to run marketing, business development, that sort of stuff. None of us were supposed to be CEO. That was part of the deal. We ended up finding a CEO in the Bay Area, and I didn't want to move, so we had to move the company. So here I was, founder of a company where I was supposed to stay on as the senior leader of the early stage and go right off into the future of that company. And we had to move it. And I wasn't willing to move to the Bay Area because at that point I had 4 kids and we were up in Seattle and we loved it. We wanted to stay up there. So I helped that company move. And shortly after that, as a consequence of that move, I worked myself out of a job. So I went back to Three Arch Partners, and I made a mistake, actually, in my description of history. The first was Three Arch and Fraser Healthcare. The second one was Three Arch and Prospect. The second one was the second Entrepreneur in Residence program I did. And to make the world small, the partner at Prospect Venture Partners that contributed into the deal was Russell Hirsch. You might remember I mentioned Russell Hirsch as one of the partners over at Mayfield Funds back in the Intuitive Surgical days.
Right.
So that's where I first met Russell. So Russell Hirsch and Mark Wan from Three Arch Partners each kicked in $1 million, and we did another incubator. And because those guys taught me how to invent, in this incubator, I was coming up with probably 150, 200 ideas. I'd have to ask John Adams, my partner in there. And it was a whole bunch of ideas. We were looking at orthopedics. We were looking at women's health. We were looking at some pediatric conditions, dermatology. We were looking all over the place. And I came up with the idea for what is now Shockwave because I happened to be looking at lithotripsy for kidney stone management. And I didn't know what lithotripsy was. So I asked John Adams, what in the hell is lithotripsy? And he said, well, Daniel, let me actually describe how I learned about lithotripsy. And he went into the story about a implantable defibrillator lead being too close to another lead and sitting on the bed linens. And then a doc hit a foot pedal and created an arc between the leads and caught the bed linens on fire. And that became a problem inside of Medtronic, right? How do we prevent this and all that sort of stuff? There was another instance, they were in an animal model and they had 2 leads too close together. And the investigator in that animal setting tapped the foot pedal again, and they saw a flash on the screen and a disruption in the cardiac signal that was not from the electricity, but it was mechanical. And he didn't know what the devil all that stuff was. So what he ended up doing was failure analysis back at Medtronic. They put 2 leads into a glass beaker and they tried to replicate. Well, for those familiar with lithotripsy, if you put 2 pacemaker leads in a glass beaker and you tap the foot pedal, you're going to do a great job of shattering that glass beaker, which is exactly what happened. All over an electrical table with high voltage all over the place. It was not a good outcome. So he decided, okay, I'm going to get smart. I'm going to put it in a plastic beaker. That's smart, right? So the glass doesn't break. He did it again. It created a geyser because all the water had no place to go but straight up, and it sprayed water all over the place. So he came to learn about lithotripsy in that way. So he explained to me how lithotripsy worked, meaning electrohydraulic lithotripsy. That was probably, I want to say it was spring or so of 2007. And December of 2007, a couple of weeks before my 4th kid was born. Actually, I made a mistake. We didn't leave then because we had 3 kids and we had 1 on the way. A couple of weeks before my 4th kid was born, came up with this harebrained idea of putting wires in balloons, and that became Shockwave. That became intravascular lithotripsy. And lo and behold, the venture capitalists didn't like the idea. They didn't like it.
Can I take a wild guess why? The market wasn't big enough. The market wasn't big enough. Am I right?
That man, the Cupid doll.
Can I need it because it's in the space of cardiovascular. I'm gonna have to mark this episode as explicit. I would like to quote my good friend, Dr. John Simpson,
John's
founder.
great.
Yeah, John's great. Yeah, he's hilarious. I'm going to have him on the show soon. So I once listened to him, and this is early in my career. Then I started to learn how venture capital works in this industry, which unfortunately it's less so venture and more so just a bunch of guys with money, you know. And so essentially, when he at the very beginning, I think his very very first company, I forgot what it was, but this is when in the whole interventional cardiology space was created. He was trying to raise money, and he was telling the story with this Japanese gentleman who was part of one of the venture groups. And this Japanese gentleman, I forgot his name. He said, it's like, with a Japanese accent, he said, we went, Dr. Simpson came to us with this company, and he was trying to raise money. And we came to him and said, Dr. Simpson, unfortunately, we can't invest because the market is very, very small. And Dr. Simpson told to us, you guys are typical Stanford dickheads because the market is small because there is no market. It needs to be developed. I always think of that. So anytime I hear this, like, oh, the venture capitalist, I'm like, oh, let me guess. Was it because there's no market? Sorry. I had to share that. I had to share that.
No
that
problem.
gem.
No problem. So, yes, it was because the market was too small. And here's why that determination was made. And this is a really, really important thing from the perspective of ideation and disruption and new product creation. It's because if you ask the cardiologist, how often do you deal with calcium that is hard for you to manage? They're going to give you an answer, and that answer is going to be less than 5%.
Right.
If you ask them, how often do you see calcification in coronary vessels? They'll answer, I see it, but it's not a problem. If instead you ask them, exactly.
There we go. It's the question you ask.
It's the opposite end of the question. If you ask them, how many times out of 100 when you deploy a stent, is it not completely deployed and 100% circular? Oh, that's probably about 25% of the time. Oh, why do you think that is? And you start peeling the onion back. And when you peel it back, you get them to a place where they realize, yeah, calcification, but it's probably fibrotic tissue and et cetera. Okay, point one. Then you go to a pathologist and you ask the question, what's actually in that stuff? And the pathologist I went to is Renu Vermani out of a CB Path, Virginia. And I got her on the phone, didn't know her. And I said, Renu, can I ask you about the pathology of lesions? And I went down this whole clinical pathway that I won't bore the audience with. And she said, well, Daniel, there's so much calcium in fibrotic lesions when you really analyze them. It's like rebar in a concrete wall. It's all over the place. And that's what keeps vessels from being able to be opened. And she said, the next thing she said blew my mind. She said, what you need is something like what they use in kidney stones. Exactly. And I had already filed my stuff. I had to mute the phone because I would have had something audible to say, oh my God, I can't believe she's going down this pathway. She said, what you need is something like what they use in kidney stones to break all that stuff up so the vessel becomes compliant. And then you'll be able to deploy stents so much better and have this, and this, all these benefits. I was like, okay, I'm definitely onto something. So I tried to go forward with it. This was in 2009. And to the credit of the venture guys, the reality is that early stage medtech funding in 2009 was awful. Absolutely terrible.
Danny, when was early stage medtech funding good? I don't know if there was a year that it was good. Even
some years where it was good.
Come on, man. Even Jay Watkins stood on stage and he's like medtech, it's a tough industry, but I stay in it. Like it's
tough. No, it's tough. It is absolutely.
We got to do something about that, but that's another conversation. Please continue.
I agree. That is another conversation. And I think I need about an hour to talk about what I think of all of that. There's a lot you can do. But in any event, so I tried to get it funded throughout 2008, didn't work. I tried to in the beginning of 2009, didn't work. And I had to shut down the incubator. The venture guys are like, sorry, we're not going to fund it. And I didn't have anything else that was worthy of taking forward. I was super passionate about this. And they said, sorry. So with the remaining funds, pay yourself a severance and give John a severance and pay off the bills, and we're just going to call it done. And I didn't even. You might as well have spoken to me in some kind of alien language. I couldn't understand what they were saying. So you got to be kidding me. We're going to do what? And I very quickly, knee jerk, said, well, I want to buy the IP. And they said, really? I said, yeah, I want to buy the IP. So I used my kid's college fund and I bought the IP.
What? How'd that conversation go over with your wife?
You mean after I did it and told her? Then?
No.
Yeah. For those
and at this moment, at that exact moment, my wife came and just shook her finger at me because I was too loud, and I the baby is sleeping. Daniel. Oh man.
No, to be fair, the acquisition was not that expensive. It was the prosecution of the patents that were expensive. So the real expense came later, to be fair.
Okay.
So in the same day,
but you believed. How could you do that? Because that's hard. That's a hard decision to make.
It's really hard. So here's how, Omar. If you go on the Shockwave's website, you'll see this little cartoony thing that they've got on there of how did it all happen from eggshells to the heart or something like that. I forgot what it is. It's a little cartoon thing. It's a perfectly accurate thing because they interviewed us to create that. Prior to that moment, we had a number of things that we tested. We mocked one up. I say we. John Adams did. He fished a pair of wires down a angioplasty balloon, and we thought it was saline, and it worked. It straight up worked. He created this high voltage board, and he's like, "You stand on that side. I'm going to stand over here because if you touch this, you might die, and I'm not going to be responsible for that. I'm an electrical engineer, and I know how this is wired, and it's dangerous as hell." So I'm like, "Okay, I'll stand over on the other side." So he took the wires, and he had a set of wires in a balloon, and then he touched them to his board, and it created a kind of a sound. And we saw water in this beaker move. I'm like, and it didn't blow up the balloon. That's so cool. Then we took an eggshell and drilled a hole in, broke a piece of an eggshell off. And you know that membrane inside of an eggshell?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about? Okay, so we drilled a hole in that, put a couple of wires, and put them like 1/10 of a millimeter away from that membrane. Drop that whole thing in saline and use the exact same thing. And we still have, I still have this video. And we delivered lithotripsy, just okay. And in doing that, we broke the eggshell. It actually blew off the back side of the membrane, and the membrane was intact, fully intact, undisturbed by the mechanical energy, undisturbed by the electrical energy. And I knew at that point we had something. That was my proof point, because that membrane is about the thickness of the endothelial lining, which sits over the calcification that is embedded in the vessel wall. So I had an analogy. And the calcification in a coronary vessel is about the thickness of an eggshell. I had an analogy, and I knew that it wouldn't pop the balloon. And I knew we could make something small enough that it would work in the coronary vessel based simply on that. That's how I got the confidence. And then it was just chutzpah. Honestly, it was just chutzpah. So I acquired the IP, and in the same day in Wilson Sonsini's office, I had a series of documents lined up. It was an acquisition of the IP, shutdown of the incubator, formation of an LLC to hold the patents, formation of Shockwave, and license of those patents to Shockwave. And on that day, January 15th, 2009, we started Shockwave. And we got seed funding of a few $100,000, did a whole bunch of experiments, enough proof point that I was able to go back to Fred Mall, tell him about it, and Fred led a Series A angel round of $4 million. And February 15th of 12, I quit what I was doing and took over as CEO full time.
That's amazing. And fast forward and let's get into some of the Avail years, but like just fast forward to today. So Shockwave is public and publicly traded. They have, at least when I checked on LinkedIn, 743 full-time employees.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize there was that many.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a lot of people. And then a market cap of $8.4 billion. So like amazing.
Yep.